All right, so just quickly introduce myself. I've been working with WebRTC now for about 3 years or so. About a year and a half ago, you noticed there wasn't really a good online resource for a blog that was really oriented at developers. So with a couple of colleagues of mine, we started the WebRTC Hacks blog. Definitely didn't think it was going to be a big deal, but we're pretty happy. We get a lot. I'm surprised. We get something around 14,000 to 15,000 unique visits a month, which is way beyond what I ever imagined. So we don't, unfortunately, I wish I had more time to post more. I do have a day job too, where I work with WebRTC, and I have for several years. So the quick pitch on behalf of my company for letting me spend some time during the day to work on the materials, and you'll see some of their slide headers. Dialogic provides a WebRTC media server, helping to do things like multi-party video conferencing, recording, transcoding, interworking type capabilities. And with that, let's start to dive into to the meat. So maybe let's start out and talk about what is WebRTC. And I'd say that one of the first things it's a world-class VoIP media engine, and it's very interesting how this came about. So in 2010, Google acquired a company known as Global IP Solutions out there, which was one of the leading voice over IP real-time voice and video media engines out there. And a year later, they took that along with some other assets they had around video codecs and some open source projects they had been heavily involved in, and turned and open sourced it into this webrtc.org community. And this is a big deal because previously, this Global IP Solutions was a company that made $10 to $20 million a year. What a year is. So, and they turned around and really made all this IP and all these capabilities available for free, and actually made it even better because now it's supported by an even larger open source community. Right? WebRTC is also a web and internet standard. So in addition to open sourcing this, they also went to the standards bodies and said, hey, what can we do to actually build a standardized way to do real-time communications over the web with this? There's two standards groups involved here. There's the W3C, which standardizes web communications, and there's the IETF, really standardizes all the things that go on over the wire and some of the underlying protocols that are used here. Right? WebRTC is also a state-of-the-art technology. So in addition to just taking some really good assets that they acquired and open sourcing them, they've made a number of improvements here to help with things like doing firewall and NAT traversal, taking a lot of the really top-notch audio and video codecs and including that. And another key point here is that encryption is mandatory. And previously in these types of real-time communications and voice over IP systems, encryption was always an option, but it was actually never a mandatory item. And now it's mandatory from day one, which is pretty significant. There's a lot of details here, and some of these points that we'll go into a lot more, discuss more. The other presenters will throughout the presentations. So WebRTC is also 3 different JavaScript APIs. The first API is get user media, and basically this allows you to grant access to the local microphone, to your video camera, or to actually a screen capture within the browser. The second one is called is a create peer connection, and this is actually what allows you to send that media wherever it might be from one point to another point. And the third API that's involved with WebRTC is the data channel API. This allows you to send arbitrary data between peers. So how many of you are familiar with or worked with WebSockets? All right, so think of WebSocket, but instead of having to go into a server, it's all peer-to-peer, right? And that's definitely one that will open up a lot of exciting possibilities. So I won't go into a ton of detail here, but I did want to show you some of what this looks like in action in case you haven't seen it before. So we'll start, which is a basic get user media, right? One of the things you'll notice here, and I'll show the code in a second, is that whenever you request the camera or microphone, all the browsers, and I'll talk more about which browsers support WebRTC, but they ask you, do you want to use your camera? So we'll say yes. You see me up here, right? And now you have the camera. So take a quick look at the code for that, just so you can see. Right? And this Get User Media API is definitely the simplest one of the three that I showed. And the basic idea is that it takes a set of constraints. The constraints allow you to specify, do you want audio, do you want video, what kind of screen resolution would you like, what kind of frame rate. If there's multiple cameras, you also have options to select which camera. And then there's a success callback and there's an error callback, right? And essentially, if you get a success, you tie that source stream into a video object inside your DOM, and then you have video. And that's really all there is. All right. The next one is a lot more complicated. It's the Create Peer Connection API. There's no way I'm going to do this justice to walk through everything, but I'll just show you a quick example. So this is actually a sample from the official Google Chrome GitHub site, and they have a bunch of other samples here. I'm going to show you some links with some other references and things to get you started here too, but this is kind of an unrealistic scenario here because we actually have two sources on the same browser. Typically this would be between one browser and a phone, or two phones, or two different browsers, right? But just to keep things simple, we're doing everything all self-contained. So we'll click Start, right? And the first thing it's going to do is actually do that Get User Media call. Right, you can see here it grabs the video. Now that part's nice and simple, and I'm going to start out just by showing you the console log here before we jump into the code. But if I hit call, well, now we have all this stuff that happens. I'm going to hang up so we don't get feedback here, and just to briefly walk you through some of the things that happen here. Right, so the first thing we do is actually we're going to create a peer connection, make a peer connection API call, right? And then we're going to add that media stream to that. And WebRTC includes this offer answer protocol that actually allows the two different peers, the WebRTC peers they're called, to negotiate back and forth. And they use a protocol called Session Description Protocol here to do that. It's very cryptic. Trent later on is going to talk a lot more about it and why he doesn't like it, and some of the things that are changing. Here's what it is. I'm not going to walk through all that, but just so the offer answer mechanism is based on the session description protocol. And actually, we can do this without any kind of centralized signaling servers here at all, if you want, like we're doing here in the browser. Right? You can actually, transfer this SDP information by carrier pigeon. People have done that, experiment, right? You actually don't need to have any centralized servers at all, although realistically, most cases you probably are, right? So another key piece of what goes on behind the scenes here, and that's very important for dealing with real-time communications and voice over IP, is the devices need to know what their IP address is so they can relay that to the other entity. So Peter, when he talks later on, is going to walk through the stack here a little bit, but just so you know, there's this process called Interactive Connectivity Establishment, ICE, which is a protocol that basically allows you to identify what your IP address is and is used as part of this offer answer exchange mechanism to share that IP address, right? And that's some of the more complex parts of WebRTC that go on. But once you go through that offer answer exchange, then you basically get the remote media stream, and then you can take that and just essentially sync it into another video element inside your DOM, and you have two videos. Right. So the third one I like to show just real briefly is the data channel. Right, and this unfortunately do not have time to go through all the detail, but actually did want to show here. All this capability that I showed here is actually done in less than 200 lines of code. or so. So certainly not a handful, but what I typically do for projects and experiments I work on, there's lots of other third-party libraries out there that actually take all this and abstract it and just make it as easy as call and specify the room that you want to call, right, and take care of things behind the scenes. This is really for people who want to get into the details. Right, the data channel really works the same way here. The only real constraints or differences here is that you want to basically specify as part of your peer connection that you want to set up a data channel here and use a create data channel command, and really from there you can send whatever data you like through that channel. This is a great API for doing something that really wasn't possible before, which is peer-to-peer data. All right, so just to show an example. All right, simple idea. WebRTC also, one of the other really nice features is allows you also to do screen share. The mechanisms to do this actually require an extension for security reasons. Don't have time to get into all that, but this is another kind of key capability that's new to WebRTC, or new with WebRTC, is the ability to very quickly, just like you can do the get user immediate call, you can basically just specify, hey, I want to use my screen or even a certain application as a source, and just show that information. All right. So what else is WebRTC? Whoops. All right. WebRTC is also a community of developers. So prior to WebRTC, if you actually dealt with real-time communications and voice over IP, you were probably in the telecom telephony industry. It's definitely a smaller group of developers out there. And WebRTC really brings this technology to a much larger audience out there of web developers. And it's also important to point out, even though it's called WebRTC, there are a lot of use cases and a lot of people, and actually some of the biggest initial use cases for WebRTC actually are within native applications too. So this is not just a web browser technology. Right? WebRTC is already very widely supported, largely because of Chrome and Firefox, which use WebRTC. And you can see here, today, as of right now, there's something, 2.5 to 2.75 billion devices that support WebRTC, and that number is poised to grow significantly. And along with that, there'll be a lot of users and a lot of different use cases here. So, from one analyst friend of mine, Dean Bubley, who does a lot of work in this area, but you can see some of his forecasts. Definitely a lot of room to incorporate this technology as and part of a lot of apps. And I'll talk a little bit more about some of the use cases and what people are doing out there. So next I'd like to transition for a few minutes into working with WebRTC. Where do we get started? And the first question is, what browsers support WebRTC? And there's, as you can see here, there's good support on Chrome. Firefox is probably 6 months to a year behind Chrome. They made a bunch of announcements recently, and they're really making more investments specifically in WebRTC. So I think that'll be pretty exciting over time. And then you see those other two off to the right, Internet Explorer and Safari. I thought this was a web standard or technology. How come these guys don't do anything? So we'll talk a little bit more about that. Trent will talk, I think, cover a little bit what Microsoft is doing here, which is they're implementing some people call it an alternative version, other people call it a newer version of WebRTC, but it's called ORTC, ObjectRTC, and they've actually made commitments to implement that in IE 12. And then of course there's Safari, which Apple never tells anybody what they're doing, so maybe they'll support it tomorrow, maybe it'll be another 2 years, right? So what do you do in the meantime? Well, there are actually a number of solutions out there to help with this. So there's plugins that you can use, or if you're really desperate, you can always fall back to Flash, RTMP, and some of those mechanisms that didn't really work too well in the past. And then, the other item here is, what about native and native development, which is a big part. And there's a lot of options here, which some of the speakers will talk through, including some native bindings that are included as part of the open source, core here. There's a lot of third-party toolkits to do this. It's probably still a little immature, but we're starting to see a lot more of, hybrid app frameworks come into play. People building things for Cordova and Xamarin. And again, lots of other SDKs and tools. So, and there's a lot of different ways to work with WebRTC. So this community's been under development for a while. There's already a large established community of developers and tools and companies out there, ecosystem that are building voice over IP products. So, not surprisingly, nearly all of them now have jumped into or are doing something on WebRTC. But probably even more exciting is that there's a lot of more web-oriented and mobile-oriented companies also jumping in here. So you have a few different options depending on the level of effort you'd like to expend and really depending on your requirements are and how much work you'd like to do. So definitely the most complex option for working with WebRTC is actually just go right to the source code and work with the official build on there. That's definitely not for the faint of heart, but there are plenty of examples of companies doing that. Another recent initiative out of Ericsson Labs, they've actually built their own implementation of WebRTC, which is different than the official build, but equivalent in its standard support and what it can do. It's probably a little more immature. I haven't actually gone through it in a whole lot of detail yet. From my perspective, it does look a little bit easier to work with. They've done some things that also more geared towards iOS type development, but that's another, I think, exciting project, and it's good to actually have multiple options out there. It does help to show maturity in the community and maturity in the implementations. And then your next option, go out there and look for development tools. The company I work for, Dialogic, sells development tools. CafeX sells development tools. Hookflash sells, So most of the vendors up here offer some sort of tools to help simplify and make using WebRTC easier. Sometimes making that more oriented towards specific applications or verticals, right? And there's a whole slew of options out there. And there's also a number of back-end considerations here. So I showed earlier the front-end JavaScript APIs, and you can get pretty far with WebRTC if you're just a front-end developer here. But as I mentioned earlier, in most cases, you're going to need some sort of signaling, right? I talked a little bit about that, interactive connectivity establishment, ICE, but as part of that protocol, there is a stun and turn server involved that you need in there. Depending on your application, you might also need a media server or some kind of media processing engine in the network. If you're connecting back to an existing phone network, you're going to need to have some sort of gateway, right? So there are some back-end considerations to consider. You can build these things on your own, and I'll show next. There's a lot of options if you don't want to do that stuff to get that from cloud providers. And another important aspect that we'll talk about here too is don't forget about the network. All right, so real-time communications is fundamentally different than loading up a web page. Right, you have a high sometimes, especially if it's video, a high bandwidth, latency sensitive stream that you need to be aware of and maintain if you want to have a good quality video or even audio qual. So if you don't want to build all that back-end infrastructure, there are a large number of vendors who offer various different forms of cloud API services and incorporates the basic WebRTC elements, but also get into other forms of like doing authentication, push notifications, helping to manage some of the the back-end bandwidth and latency type issues out there. There are a lot of options. And finally, if you're just more of a web administrator and you just want to add a simple click-to-call or kind of video chat capability to your website, there are an emerging and growing number of just simple plugins and widgets, kind of simple cut and paste code snippets you can use to add WebRTC to your website. So I just went through a lot here. I'm not going to go into details on what vendor does what, or whether it gets very complex. I do, on the WebRTC Hacks blog, keep a list of tool vendors. So I have about 100 there now. I have a list of at least 30 more that I need to add, and it's growing every day. I hope I catch up to that after this. But if you want a good idea where to start, I do maintain this list, and allows you to, at least you can filter based on what kind of development skills you have or what you're looking for, and if you're just looking for an open source project, or if you'd rather work with a commercial vendor, that sort of thing. So I encourage you to check that out if you'd like to start down the path to figure out what vendor you'd want to work with. And here's also a list of some of my personal favorite resources. Not surprising, I put my blog here on top, but I will say, I'm not a professional developer. I develop for fun, which is fun, I guess, is good. When I have questions, or I don't know something, or I have, it is great to be able to go out to some of the industry experts and the people that are part of the standards bodies and do this, and just ask them, hey, can you write a technical brief on this, or can I ask you a few questions, can you walk through it? So I use the blog to answer the questions I have out there, and certainly if other people have questions, let me know. I'm happy to try to find people to write about it if I can't do it myself. So a few other good sites here. There's this WebRTC experiment. And this is really from an amazing guy, a remote village in Pakistan, and doesn't even have power throughout the year, but he's just basically taken every capability that you could think of with WebRTC and done some sort of code sample or snippet from it. So I definitely recommend that one. And then there's a bunch of Google-backed or Google-oriented sites here. I showed earlier the GitHub site. There's HTML5 Rocks, which has some really good examples there. And then a couple other friends of mine run this WebRTC Weekly, which is just a weekly newsletter that links to other blogs and other kind of news for WebRTC. But if you want to just stay in the loop on what's going on in WebRTC, I definitely recommend signing up for that newsletter. All right, and the last piece I'd like to cover is what are some use cases, right? And probably the easiest one, maybe the most boring for some people, but it's just making phone calls. And the ability to make a phone call from a web. Tobias will talk about this a little bit more, some of the contact center implications there, how big this is, but you forget that 6 billion or so mobile phones out there, and about 1 billion landline phones out there, and that's a lot of people you can connect to. So the ability to just make simple phone calls is actually very novel and actually a very important part of WebRTC. But getting beyond that, you can, in similar scenarios, you can actually not just make phone calls, but you can enable video. And Chris will show a little bit of this with the American Express. Has anyone, probably a bunch of you have heard about Amazon and the Mayday service they had for the Kindle Fire here, and their new Kindle phones. That infrastructure and that service actually is based on WebRTC, right? So that's a good example of a unique use case for WebRTC. The agent can see your screen to help you out, but you can't see the agent because you don't really want your agent looking at you when you're in your pajamas or you just got out of bed. So some other interesting ones. WebRTC really allows you to use communications as a feature. And for a lot of existing applications out there, probably it's not the primary function to be able to do a real-time video or audio call, but it might be something that's nice. And Snapchat's a good example of this. They acquired one of the WebRTC startups out there, and they've embedded this ability to do just kind of simple push to video as part of Snapchat using WebRTC. All right. Peter will talk a little bit about some of the ways that Google uses WebRTC in some of the projects. One of the big ones is for Chromecast, and WebRTC, because it's peer-to-peer and very low latency in nature, it's a really good real-time media streaming protocol. All right, some of the more interesting things here, leveraging the data channel, are its peer-to-peer data channel applications out there. Augmented reality, all right, because if you can grab that live video stream and manipulate it, there's a lot of cool things you can do with that. Facial biometric verification is another example of how do we take this and take the video stream and use that to do something. There's a really great examples, and I see a lot more of this, is controlling robots. And this example, experiment that was done at the Tate Museum in London, where they actually allowed people to remotely control robots and rove around the museum at night to look at the artwork, right? All using WebRTC. And this is one of my experiments that I did recently, is training your dog. My dog kept jumping up on the couch, and I was trying to figure out how to get him to not do that. So I set up a system to basically do a camera feed, alert on motion, send me an MMS message, and allow me to do a video call in, yell at him, get off the couch. And when he didn't do that, because he never does, hit a button, and I had this remotely controlled based microcontroller, hooked up to one of my son's toys I used to push him off. And I'm happy to say it actually has worked. He no longer gets on the couch. It took a little while. So. All right, so my contact information is here. Like I said, I'll be hanging on afterward and be doing introductions to the other speakers.